The sky over Lake Michigan had not yet turned blue. It hung in the early dawn as a heavy, bruise-colored slab of dark slate. A bitter autumn wind swept off the water, whistling through the high iron gates of the Lakeshore Estate and rattling the floor-to-ceiling glass panels of the Grand Gallery. Inside, the 20,000-square-foot mansion was as silent as a tomb, a vast, hollow monument of polished white marble, imported granite, and cold, unyielding luxury. Julian Hayes woke up abruptly. He was 36 years old, a senior managing partner at one of Chicago's most aggressive hedge funds. He lived his life governed by cold, mathematical certainty, quarterly yields, algorithmic risk assessments, and rigid schedules. But as he stood on the cold marble floor of his second-floor master suite, an unnatural, suffocating stillness gripped the air. It was 5:15 a.m. Usually, by this time, the soft hum of the central climate system was punctuated by the distant, muffled sounds of household preparation. But today, the silence was absolute. Julian pulled on a charcoal wool robe and walked down the grand corridor, his bare feet slapping against the cold floorboards. He reached the heavy mahogany door of the nursery, turning the silver handle. "Nanny Sarah?" he called out softly, pushing the door open. The nursery was empty. The silk drapes were drawn back. The rocking chair sat motionless in the dim light, and the hand-carved Italian crib in the center of the room was completely bare. The white organic cotton sheet was pulled back, the blanket was gone, and his 1-year-old daughter, Maya, was nowhere to be seen. Panic, raw, violent, and uncalculated, surged through Julian's chest like an electric shock. "Sarah!" he called out louder, his voice echoing off the high plaster ceilings. He turned and marched down the hallway, throwing open the doors to the guest suites, the nanny's private quarters, and the executive kitchen. "Sarah, where's my daughter?" There was no answer. The nanny's quarters were immaculate and undisturbed. Her bed had not been slept in. Julian's mind raced through every dark, terrifying scenario that his immense wealth attracted: extortion, domestic intrusion, an emergency medical evacuation. He rushed to the central security terminal near the service entrance, his hands shaking as he swiped through the live camera feeds. Camera 4, the main garden terrace, showed a sudden, faint flickering of movement near the perimeter path. Julian didn't pause to put on shoes. He threw open the heavy rear glass doors and stepped directly onto the frost-dusted stone terrace. The biting Chicago wind hit his bare skin like 100 tiny needles, but he didn't feel the cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a sledgehammer as he ran down the limestone steps into the manicured formal garden. "Maya!" he shouted into the dark, foggy air, his voice hoarse. "Maya!" He rounded the dense boxwood hedge framing the stone fountain path, and what he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. There, sitting on a damp, frost-covered stone bench beneath the bare branches of a weeping willow, was Clara Jenkins. She was 42 years old, his quiet, domestic housekeeper, a woman he had hired 7 months prior who usually moved through the mansion like an invisible shadow, scrubbing floors and folding linens without making a sound. Clara was sitting completely rigid, her back pressed against the cold stone, her head tilted back against the damp masonry, her eyes closed in deep, exhausted sleep. She was still wearing her dark blue housekeeping uniform, her white apron smudged with charcoal dust, and on her hands were her bright yellow rubber cleaning gloves, their fingers worn and stained at the tips. Clutched tightly, fiercely against her chest, tucked deep beneath her chin, was baby Maya. A faded, threadbare blue wool blanket, not one of the expensive cashmere throws from a nursery, was wrapped 3 times around the infant's body, binding the child so closely to Clara's chest that it was difficult to tell where the woman's uniform ended and the baby began. Clara's yellow-gloved hands were locked across the small child's back like a human fortress, shielding her from the razor-sharp lake wind. Julian stood frozen on the gravel path, 3 feet away. For a full 5 seconds, he couldn't draw breath. A wave of intense, furious confusion boiled up in his throat. What is she doing out here in the freezing dark with my baby? Is she insane? Is this neglect? He took a sharp step forward, his bare foot crunching loudly against the frozen gravel. Clara, he demanded, his voice tight and razor-sharp. Neither of them stirred. Julian leaned down, his eyes wide with terror, reaching out to rip his daughter from the housekeeper's arms. But as his hand hovered inches from the blue blanket, he stopped. Through the dim, gray morning light, he saw it. Baby Maya's tiny chest was rising and falling in a slow, deep, perfect rhythm. Her small, chubby fingers were firmly intertwined with the fabric of Clara's blue uniform collar. Her face was buried warm and snug against the curve of Clara's neck, completely protected from the biting air. And on Clara's pale, exhausted face, despite the frost clinging to her hair, despite the shivering of her shoulders, despite the cold stone biting through her thin uniform, was a look of absolute, profound protective peace. It was not irresponsibility. It was not neglect. It was a fierce, primitive act of protection. The kind of love that money could never purchase. The kind of love that carries a child through the darkest storm, even when it breaks the person holding them. And in that still, freezing moment, as the sun began to peek over the dark waters of Lake Michigan, everything Julian Hayes believed about his wealth, his control, and what it meant to protect a family began to crack wide open. Before we go any further into this incredible journey, please click the subscribe button, like this video, and tell us in the comments below where in the world you are watching from today. I hope this story reminds you that sometimes the people we overlook in our daily lives are the very ones holding our entire world together. Julian crouched down beside the damp stone bench, his bare knees touching the frozen grass. The frost bit into his skin, but his eyes were locked on the yellow rubber glove resting over his daughter's tiny back. Carefully, reverently, Julian touched the edge of the blue blanket. It was dry and surprisingly warm, trapping Clara's body heat inside like an incubator. Clara's eyelids fluttered. She stirred, her breath coming out in a sudden, ragged gasp of white fog. As her hazel eyes opened and focused on Julian's face hovering inches away, absolute terror flashed across her features. "Mr. Hayes," Clara gasped, her voice raspy and trembling from the cold. She scrambled to stand up, her joints stiff, her arms instantly tightening around Maya to ensure the baby didn't slip. I'm so sorry, sir. Oh, dear God, I'm so sorry." "Clara, stop," Julian said, his voice unusually low, lacking its usual corporate bite. "Don't try to stand yet. What happened? Why are you out here on a garden bench at 5 in the morning with my daughter?" Clara lowered her head, tears welling in her tired eyes, spilling over her pale cheeks. She didn't look at him. She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, her hands, still encased in those bright yellow rubber gloves, trembling uncontrollably. "The furnace, sir," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "The heating unit in the east wing. It shut down around 2 in the morning. The radiators started knocking, and then the air in the nursery turned ice cold." Julian's brow furrowed. "Why didn't you call maintenance? Why didn't you wake me up?" "I tried, Mr. Hayes," Clara said softly, looking up at him with a desperate, unvarnished honesty. "I called the property manager's line 3 times. It went straight to voicemail. I walked to the main house, but the interior connecting doors were locked for the night. I knocked on your study door, but you weren't home yet, sir. You were at the late-night investment gala downtown." Julian felt a sudden, sickening knot tighten in his gut. He remembered his phone vibrating at 2:30 a.m. while he was sipping $100 scotch in a private club downtown. He had glanced at the unknown internal estate caller ID and swiped it away, dismissing it as an automated system error. "Nanny Sarah left at midnight," Clara continued, her chin quivering. "She said her shift was over and her car was waiting. When I went into the nursery at 2, the baby was shivering, Mr. Hayes. Her hands were blue. Her lips were cold. She was crying so hard she couldn't catch her breath. I brought her down to the boiler room, but the air was thick with soot fumes. The only place in this entire estate that had shelter from the draft was the glass sunroom nook near the garden path." Clara swallowed hard, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her yellow rubber glove. "I wrapped her in my late grandmother's wool blanket," she murmured. "I sat on the bench in the sheltered corner where the wind couldn't hit her. I rocked her. I held her against my own chest inside my coat to use my body heat to keep her warm. I only meant to sit with her until her shivering stopped. I swear to you, Mr. Hayes, I didn't mean to fall asleep. Please, please don't take her from me. Please don't fire me. Julian stood up slowly. He looked at Clara, her thin body shivering violently, her uniform smudged, her face pale from hours in the freezing air. And then he looked at his daughter, who was warm, peaceful, and resting soundly against the housekeeper's apron. Come inside, Clara, Julian said quietly. Sir, come inside. Now. Julian didn't reach out to grab Maya. He turned and led the way up the stone terrace steps, holding the heavy glass door open wide. Clara followed him on stiff, awkward legs, her flat shoes squeaking softly against the polished marble floor of the grand gallery. The heat of the main house hit them, but the silence inside felt heavier, colder than the wind outside. Julian guided her not to the small, cramped servants' break room tucked behind the laundry pantry, but to the grand executive kitchen. Sit down, Julian said, gesturing to one of the leather-upholstered bar stools at the central granite island. Clara hesitated, looking down at her dirty uniform and yellow gloves. Mr. Hayes, I shouldn't sit at your table. I said sit down, Clara. She sat down gently, holding Maya against her chest as if she were made of spun glass. Julian walked to the commercial espresso machine, filled a mug with hot water, stirred in 2 spoonfuls of honey, and set it down directly in front of her. Then he pulled out the stool across from her and sat down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic breathing of baby Maya sleeping soundly against Clara's shoulder. Julian looked at her hands. The bright yellow rubber cleaning gloves, torn slightly at the index finger, stained with furniture polish and floor wax. She hadn't even taken them off to protect herself from the cold. Her only thought had been keeping the baby insulated. Clara, Julian said softly, his voice echoing in the vast kitchen. Who taught you how to hold a child like that? Clara's body went completely still. She stared down at a tiny scratch in the granite island top. Her lips parted, but no sound came out for several seconds. My daughter, she whispered finally. Julian leaned forward slightly, his sharp corporate edge entirely gone. Your daughter? I didn't know you had a child. It wasn't on your application file. She's gone, sir, Clara said. Her voice was remarkably even, but it carried a weight of grief so dense, so dark, that it seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Her name was Ava. She was 2 years old. Julian didn't speak. He barely dared to breathe. It was 7 years ago, Clara continued, her eyes fixed on the granite surface. We lived in a small 2-room apartment in southern Indiana. My husband had left us 3 months prior. It was a terrible winter, colder than this. The landlord cut the building's oil heat because I was 3 weeks late on rent. She pressed her yellow-gloved hands together until her knuckles turned white inside the rubber. I didn't have money for space heaters, Clara whispered, a single, heavy tear falling onto her apron. I bundled Ava up in every sweater and blanket I owned. She got a fever in the middle of the night. I tried to warm her, then I tried to bring the fever down with wet rags. I sat in an old wooden rocking chair, holding her pressed against my chest all night long, praying, begging God to let her make it until the clinic opened at 8 in the morning. Clara's voice broke, catching in her throat like broken glass. When the sun came up, she choked out. I looked down at her, and she was gone. She had slipped away in my arms while I was holding her. Julian felt as if someone had struck him in the chest with a heavy iron bar. He sat frozen, staring at the woman across the table. I failed her, Clara whispered, her head bowing low, her forehead almost touching the granite counter. 3 words. That's what I've said to myself every single morning for 7 years. I failed my baby girl because I couldn't keep her warm. And when I lost her, I lost my life. I lost everything. She looked up then, just once, and Julian saw the depth of the ocean of pain she carried inside her quiet soul. When I took this job, Clara whispered, looking down at baby Maya, and I saw how you worked all those 20-hour days, how this big, beautiful house was always so quiet. I looked at little Maya, and I told myself a promise. I swore to Ava in heaven that if I was ever blessed enough to be near another child, I would never let go. Not for anything. Not for tiredness. Not for fear. Not for cold. Silence filled the grand kitchen, a sacred, heavy silence. Julian looked from Clara's tear-stained face to his daughter, who was still fast asleep, her cheek pressed against the yellow rubber glove that held her safe. And for the first time in his adult life, Julian Hayes, a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, felt completely, utterly poor. In the weeks that followed that freezing morning in the garden, a subtle but profound transformation began to take place within the walls of the Lakeshore estate. Julian found himself making unprecedented changes to his schedule. He canceled non-essential evening dinners in downtown Chicago. He instructed his administrative assistants that he would be working from his home study 3 days a week. He began walking through the grand hallways slower, listening to the house instead of marching through it with his eyes glued to his tablet. The house was warmer now, not merely because the industrial heating boilers had been replaced, but because Julian had started noticing the quiet rhythm of love that held his home together. He watched from his study doorway as Clara worked. She didn't just clean the nursery. She moved through it with a quiet, reverent grace. When she folded Maya's tiny clothes, she did so one piece at a time, smoothing the cotton with her palms. When Maya woke up from her afternoon naps, it was Clara's voice she heard first. Not a loud, commercial toy, but Clara softly humming old Southern hymns while tidying the crib linens. One afternoon, Julian watched as Maya, sitting on the plush nursery rug, reached her small arms up toward Clara as she passed by with a basket of laundry. Clara set the basket down immediately, dropped to her knees, and pulled the toddler into her arms. Maya let out a loud, ringing, joyful giggle, burying her face in Clara's neck and murmuring a soft, half-formed word. "Mama see." Clara froze, a look of overwhelming emotion washing across her face, before she kissed the child's forehead and held her close. Julian stood in the shadow of the doorway, a soft, unaccustomed smile touching his lips. But while Julian's heart was softening, not everyone who entered the Lakeshore estate viewed Clara's presence with grace. 2 weeks later, on a bright Thursday afternoon, a sleek black sports car pulled up the winding driveway. Out stepped Victoria Hayes, Julian's older sister. Victoria was a woman defined by social standing, elite status, and rigid class boundaries. She wore an expensive designer coat, carried a $5,000 handbag, and moved through the world with the absolute conviction that wealth was a measure of human superiority. She walked into the grand gallery, tossing her coat onto the foyer bench without looking at the staff. "Julian," Victoria announced loudly, stepping into the main living room where Julian was reading a financial brief while Clara sat on the rug nearby, helping Maya build a tower with wooden blocks. The gate was open. "You really need to reprimand the security detail." Victoria stopped mid-sentence, her sharp blue eyes darting down to Clara, who was dressed in her simple blue housekeeping uniform. "Why is the cleaning woman sitting on the rug playing with the baby?" Victoria asked, her tone dripping with immediate, icy condescension. "Isn't Sarah supposed to be on duty?" "Sarah was let go 2 weeks ago." "Victoria," Julian said calmly, setting his file down. "Clara has been looking after Maya." Victoria's eyebrows shot up. She crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets clinking together. "Looking after her?" "Julian, she is hired for domestic sanitation, not child-rearing. Look at her. She's in her work uniform on your Persian rug." Clara's cheeks flushed a deep, painful red. She immediately stood up, keeping her eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes. I was just finishing up the nursery organization. I'll take the laundry down to the basement." "Please do," Victoria said coldly, not even looking at Clara as the housekeeper gathered her basket and quietly hurried out of the room. Once Clara was out of earshot, Victoria turned on Julian, her voice low and sharp. "Have you completely lost your mind, Julian? You are blurring lines that should never be crossed. She is the help. She sleeps in the staff quarters behind the garage. She scrubs toilets for a living, and you have her sitting on the floor acting like this child's mother." Clara saved Maya's life when the heating system failed. Victoria, Julian said, his voice dangerous, a dark edge rising beneath his tone. She held her in the freezing dark for hours to keep her warm while I was at a gala. She did her job. Victoria snapped back, waving her hand dismissively. You pay her a salary. That doesn't make her family, Julian. Staff like that. They see a grieving widower with money, and they start positioning themselves. She's trying to make herself indispensable. She's crossing boundaries. And if you aren't careful, she's going to start making demands. Julian stared at his sister, his jaw tight, his hands clenching in a fist inside his pockets. She has never asked for a single cent beyond her wage, Victoria. She works 18 hours a day without complaining. Because she knows her place, Victoria said sharply. Or at least, she used to. You need to put her back in her box, Julian, before she forgets who she works for. Victoria's cruel words did not stay in the living room. They floated through the corridors like poison. Over the next several days, the other household staff, the junior butler, the groundskeeper, and the temporary night nurse, began to absorb Victoria's attitude. They saw how Julian looked at Clara with respect, and jealousy festered in the quiet corners of the estate. Whispers started in the staff kitchen. She thinks she's special just because she stayed up one night. Look at her, trying to play mother to a billionaire's child. She's just a maid. She needs to remember what color her apron is. Clara heard them. She heard every single whisper. She heard the deliberate snickers when she walked into the pantry. She saw the cold, side glances when she picked Maya up to soothe the crying spell. Clara didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She did what she had done her entire life when the world turned cruel. She retreated into the shadows. She stopped smiling in the hallways. She waited until the main gallery was completely empty before walking through to clean. When Julian entered a room where she was playing with Maya, Clara would immediately stand up, hand the baby to him with downcast eyes, apologize for intruding, and disappear into the basement laundry room. Julian noticed the sudden, painful shift. He saw the way Clara shrank away whenever someone walked into the room. He saw the heavy, heartbreaking weight returning to her shoulders. The weight of a woman who was being reminded by a cold, cruel world that she didn't belong anywhere. And as the dark clouds of prejudice and jealousy gathered over the Lakeshore estate, Julian Hayes realized that keeping his daughter safe from the cold was only half the battle. He was going to have to protect the woman who had saved her from the very people he called family. The toxic whispers within the Lakeshore estate grew heavier with each passing day. Clara Jenkins moved through the grand corridors like a ghost, her head bowed, her shoulders curved inward as if trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She took her meals alone in the basement laundry room, sitting on a wooden bench near the hum of the industrial dryer, her hands folded in her lap. She no longer hummed her old Southern hymns. She no longer smiled when she walked past the grand living room. Every word Victoria had spoken, she's the help. She's trying to position herself. She needs to remember what color her apron is, echoed in Clara's mind like an unceasing, relentless chant. Clara knew what it meant to be unwanted. She knew the bitter, sharp taste of being viewed as an intruder in a place where she had given her heart. She didn't want to cause trouble for Julian. She didn't want to be the reason his family fractured. And above all, she could not bear the thought of being driven out in disgrace if Victoria eventually convinced Julian to let her go. On a cold Wednesday evening, as a heavy rain slashed against the glass panels of the estate, Clara made her decision. She went to her small quarters behind the garage. She pulled a battered, brown vinyl suitcase from beneath her metal bed frame and packed her few belongings. 3 simple dresses, 2 worn sweaters, her grandmother's blue wool blanket, and a small framed photograph of her late daughter, Ava. She sat at the small pine desk, pulled out a piece of plain stationery, and wrote a short, quiet note in her neat, looping script. Dear Mr. Hayes, thank you for your kindness to me over these past 7 months, and for allowing me to care for sweet little Maya. I never meant to cause any division or trouble in your home or with your family. Maya is a precious angel, and has been the greatest blessing of my life to hold her. I think it is best for everyone if I leave quietly before any more hurtful words are spoken. My suitcase is packed by the door. Please do not worry about my final wages. May God bless you and keep Maya safe always. Clara. She folded the note carefully, placed it on the granite kitchen island beside the espresso machine, and set her house key on top of it. Carrying her heavy vinyl suitcase, Clara walked down the long, gravel driveway toward the main iron gates. The rain soaked through her thin wool coat, plastering her hair to her forehead, but she didn't turn back. Her heart felt heavy, hollowed out, as if a vital piece of her soul were being left behind in the nursery upstairs. She had just reached the outer stone pillars when the bright headlights of Julian's sports car cut through the rain and fog. Julian slammed on his brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. He threw his car door open and stepped out into the pouring rain, his eyes wide with shock as he saw Clara standing near the open pedestrian gate, her suitcase resting in the puddles beside her feet. "Clara!" Julian shouted over the sound of the rain. "What are you doing? Where are you going?" Clara pulled her coat tighter around her shivering shoulders, keeping her eyes fixed on the wet ground. "I'm leaving, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "It's time for me to go." Julian marched through the downpour, stopping directly in front of her. He looked at the battered brown suitcase in the mud, then up at her pale, tear-streaked face. "Why?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking with a sudden, desperate emotion. "Because of what Victoria said? Because of the staff whispering in the kitchen?" "They're right, sir," Clara whispered, her chin trembling. "I'm just the housekeeper. I clean the floors and fold the clothes. I let myself forget my place because I loved your daughter so much. But I can't stay here while people whisper that I'm trying to take advantage of your grief. I won't cause trouble for you." Julian stepped closer, his tailored suit jacket soaking through with rainwater. He reached out and grabbed the handle of her suitcase, pulling it out of the mud. "You listen to me, Clara," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce, unyielding tone that cut straight through the roaring wind. "My sister doesn't know what holds this house together. Those people in the kitchen don't know what matters. You didn't take advantage of anything. You stepped into a cold, dead home and gave my daughter the only real warmth she has ever known." Clara looked up, her hazel eyes swimming with fresh tears. "You aren't leaving, Clara," Julian declared softly, his eyes locked onto hers with absolute conviction. "You don't leave the place where you belong." He picked up her suitcase with one hand and offered her his other arm. Clara stared at his outstretched hand for 3 long seconds. A man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, standing drenched in a cold autumn downpour, offering his arm to his housekeeper. Slowly, her shaking hand reached out and rested against his sleeve. They walked back up the driveway together. Neither of them knew that within 3 hours, the fragile peace they had just reclaimed would be tested by a terrifying life-or-death crisis. At midnight, the quiet of the Lakeshore estate was shattered by a sharp, high-pitched scream from the nursery monitor in Julian's bedroom. Julian bolted out of bed, throwing his robe on as he ran down the corridor. He burst into the nursery to find Clara already there, standing over the crib, her face pale with absolute horror. Baby Maya was thrashing against the white mattress. Her skin was flushed a deep, unnatural crimson. Her small lips were dry and cracked, and her body was shaking violently with rigors. When Julian reached into the crib and touched his daughter's chest, her skin felt like scalding iron. "She's burning, Mr. Hayes," Clara cried out, her hands hovering over the child, terrified to touch her. "Her fever, it came on in minutes." Julian pulled his phone from his robe pocket, his fingers slick with cold sweat as he dialed his private concierge medical team. "Get Dr. Marcus here now." Julian roared into the receiver. "My daughter has a sudden, extreme febrile spike. Move." Within 20 minutes, the quiet, peaceful nursery looked like an emergency trauma room. Dr. Marcus, Chicago's top pediatric specialist, arrived with 2 emergency nurses and portable medical equipment. The room filled with the cold, sterile smells of rubbing alcohol and antiseptic. Monitored wires were attached to Maya's tiny chest. A pulse oximeter clip was fastened to her foot, beeping in a rapid, terrifying staccato cadence. "Her core temperature is 104.8 degrees and climbing," Dr. Marcus announced, his voice tight with professional anxiety as he checked the digital thermometer. "We're dealing with a severe, rapid-onset neurofebrile response. Administer intravenous antipyretics immediately." Julian stood against the nursery wall, his hands pressed against his face, feeling completely helpless. All his wealth, all his connections, all his corporate power were utterly useless against the invisible storm burning inside his daughter's tiny body. An hour passed, then two. The medical team administered high-dose cooling medication, placed ice packs along the infant's legs, and monitored her vitals continuously. But the digital monitors showed no mercy. 105.1 degrees. Heart rate, 185 BPM. Maya's eyes rolled back. Her breathing became shallow, rapid, and labored, a terrifying, rattling gasp that filled the room. Dr. Marcus stepped back from the crib, wiping sweat from his forehead, looking at Julian with a rare, terrible flicker of fear in his eyes. "The intravenous antipyretics aren't responding, Mr. Hayes. Her central nervous system is overheating. If we can't break this thermal spike in the next 15 minutes, her brainstem is going to suffer irreversible neurological trauma." Julian's knees fell hollow. "Then do something," he begged, his voice breaking, stepping toward the doctor. "Use another drug. Call the hospital. Take my blood. Do something." "We've administered the maximum allowable clinical dosages," Dr. Marcus whispered, shaking his head in grim despair. "Her body is in a systemic shock loop. Medicine can't force the temperature down if her brain won't signal the cooling response." A heavy, suffocating cloud of despair settled over the room. The nurses lowered their heads. The digital monitor beeped erratically. Then, from the dark shadow near the nursery door, Clara Jenkins stepped forward. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't look at Dr. Marcus. She didn't check the digital monitors. Clara walked straight to the crib, pushed past the stainless steel four stands, and reached her hands into the warm bed. One of the nurses stepped forward to stop her. "Ma'am, you can't touch the patient while the lines are active." But Julian immediately raised his hand, his voice raspy and absolute. "Let her through." Clara lifted baby Maya out of the crib. She unclipped the harsh plastic leads from the child's skin, ignoring the blaring electronic warning alarms. She sat down in the wooden rocking chair near the window, holding the burning, shaking infant tightly against her chest, wrapping her arms around Maya, just as she had done on the freezing garden bench weeks before. Clara began to rock. Back and forth, back and forth. The old floorboards creaked softly under the chair. Clara bowed her head until her lips were resting against Maya's burning forehead. Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks, falling onto the child's flushed skin. And then, in a voice that was raspy, broken, but filled with a deep, ancient, spiritual strength, Clara began to sing. It was not a lullaby from a children's book. It was an old, slow Southern hymn, the exact same hymn she had sung to her late daughter, Ava, on that dark winter night 7 years ago. "Deep River, my home is over Jordan. Deep River, Lord, I want to cross over in a campground." Her voice trembled, catching on the notes, but she didn't stop. She rocked rhythmically, pressing her chest against the child's chest, letting her own calm, steady heartbeat force its rhythm upon the racing, terrified heart of the infant. "Oh, don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that promised land where all is peace?" Dr. Marcus opened his mouth to object, but the words died in his throat. The nursery fell completely silent except for Clara's low, melodious humming and the steady creak of the rocking chair. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The rapid, terrifying rattle in Maya's chest began to slow. Her gasping breaths lengthened, deepening into a smooth, steady rhythm. The violent trembling in her tiny limbs relaxed, melting away as her body surrendered to the comforting, familiar warmth of Clara's embrace. Dr. Marcus silently reached down and touched the thermal scanner to Maya's forehead. He looked at the digital readout, his eyes widening in absolute, speechless shock. 102.1, the doctor whispered, his voice trembling. "It's dropping. 101.4, 100.2. The fever is breaking." The emergency nurses let out a collective, audible gasp of relief. Maya's small, chubby fingers, which had been clenched into tight fists, slowly uncurled. She reached up, her tiny hand brushing against Clara's wet cheek, her eyelids fluttering open to look up at Clara with soft, trusting recognition. She let out a quiet, contented sigh and fell into a deep, peaceful, healing sleep. Clara didn't stop rocking. She buried her face in the child's soft hair, her shoulders shaking with quiet, silent tears of profound gratitude. Julian stood near the doorway, his back pressed against the wall, tears streaming freely down his face. He looked at his doctor, who simply shook his head in awe, packing his medical bag without saying another word. Because everyone in that room knew the truth. What had saved Julian Hay's daughter that night was not found in a pharmaceutical bottle or a high-tech medical monitor. It was found in the fierce, unbreakable, redemptive love of a woman who had lost her own child and refused to let death steal another. The following evening, the grand formal dining room of the Lakeshore Estate was prepared for an unprecedented event. The 30-foot mahogany table was set with sterling silver, crystal stemware, and white linen. Julian had summoned everyone. His sister Victoria, his senior corporate legal counsel, his wealth manager, the property manager, the butler, the kitchen staff, and the groundskeepers. Victoria sat near the head of the table in a silk dress, sipping sparkling water, looking around the room in deep confusion. "Julian, what is the meaning of this?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying its usual sharp, aristocratic edge. "Why are the domestic staff sitting at the main table? This is completely improper." Julian stood at the head of the table. He wore a crisp, dark suit, but he had no folder, no tablet, and no financial brief in front of him. His face was grave, steady, and filled with an absolute, terrifying clarity. At the far end of the table sat Clara Jenkins. She was still wearing her dark blue housekeeping uniform, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her head bowed in deep self-consciousness, entirely unsure why she had been asked to sit among the wealthy and powerful. Julian raised his glass, tapping it once with a silver spoon. The sharp ring echoed off the vaulted ceiling, bringing the room to an absolute, immediate silence. "Thank you all for coming," Julian began, his voice low, clear, and vibrating through the quiet room. "Last night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, my daughter Maya almost died." A collective, sharp gasp rippled through the table. Victoria froze, her glass stopping halfway to her lips. "She suffered a sudden, catastrophic febrile spike," Julian continued, his eyes scanning the faces of his family and staff. "Her temperature reached over 105 degrees. The top pediatric specialists in Chicago were in her nursery with advanced equipment and clinical medications. And despite everything my fortune could buy, medicine failed. The doctor looked at me and told me my daughter was going to suffer permanent brain damage within minutes." Victoria's face turned pale. "Julian, my God, why didn't you call me?" Julian didn't answer her. He turned his eyes slowly down the length of the long table, locking his gaze onto Clara. And then, Julian said, his voice thickening with emotion, "This woman stepped forward." The room shifted. Everyone turned to look at Clara, who shrank back slightly in her chair, her cheeks flushing red. "Clara didn't ask for a medical consultation," Julian said softly. "She didn't check a schedule. She picked my dying daughter up out of her crib, wrapped her in her arms, sat in a wooden chair, and sang an old Southern hymn to her for 40 minutes. She put her own heart against my daughter's heart until Maya's body remembered how to live. She saved my child's life." Julian paused. The silence in the dining room was absolute. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe. "Over the past few weeks," Julian continued, his tone turning razor-sharp as he looked directly at his sister Victoria and then at the junior staff members, "I have heard the whispers in this house. I have heard people say that Clara is just the help. I have heard people say that she is crossing boundaries, that she doesn't belong at this table, that she is trying to take advantage of my family." Victoria looked down at her plate, her face burning with intense embarrassment. The butler and kitchen staff shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I want to make something crystal clear to everyone in this room tonight, Julian declared, his voice ringing out like a thunderclap across the marble room. Wealth does not make a family. Money does not buy grace. The woman sitting at the end of this table risked her health in the freezing cold for my child. She gave up her sleep, her comfort, and her tears to keep Maya alive. Julian did something that no one in the room, least of all Clara, ever expected. He stepped away from the head of the table. He walked down the length of the grand dining room, stopping directly beside Clara's chair. And there, in front of his sister, his executives, and his entire staff, Julian Hayes dropped to his knees on the hard marble floor beside his housekeeper. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Mr. Hayes, please get up." Julian looked up at her, tears standing in his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Clara," Julian said, his voice cracking with pure, unvarnished gratitude. "Thank you for saving my daughter. And thank you for teaching me what it actually means to be a father." Clara's lips parted, but no words came out. Tears spilled freely over her eyelashes, falling onto her dark blue uniform. Julian stood up, turned to face the entire room, and delivered his final, absolute decree. From this day forward, Clara Jenkins is not an employee in this house. She does not scrub these floors. She does not take orders from anyone. She is a permanent, honored member of the Hayes family. And anyone who fails to treat her with the absolute love and respect she deserves will be removed from this property immediately. Not a single person objected. Not a single voice whispered. Victoria looked at Clara, her eyes moist with genuine remorse, offering a slow, respectful nod of defeat and understanding. The cold, hollow museum of the Lakeshore estate had finally shattered. In its place, something warm, real, and unbreakable had been born. 3 days later, the morning sun broke over Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant, golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the nursery. The mansion felt completely transformed. The heavy, suffocating silence that had defined the estate for years was gone, replaced by the soft, melodious sound of Clara humming in the kitchen, the aroma of fresh coffee and warm pastries, and the bright, ringing sound of baby laughter echoing down the corridors. Julian walked into the nursery wearing a simple sweater and jeans. He had taken the entire month off from his hedge fund to spend every single day at home with his daughter. Clara was sitting in the wooden rocking chair by the window, wearing a simple, elegant rose-colored dress that Julian had ordered for her. Maya was sitting in her lap, playing happily with a soft plush bear. "Good morning, Clara," Julian said with a warm smile, stepping into the sunlit room. "Good morning, Julian," she replied softly, using his first name for the very first time, her voice steady and peaceful. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dark velvet jewelry box. He stepped over to the rocking chair and held it out to her. Clara looked at the velvet box, her eyebrows drawing together in gentle confusion. "Julian, what is this? You've already done far too much for me. Open it," Julian insisted gently. Clara took the velvet box, her fingers trembling slightly as she popped the brass latch open. Inside, resting against white silk, was a delicate, beautifully crafted solid gold locket suspended from a fine gold chain. The locket was shaped like a small heart. Clara carefully lifted it, pressing the tiny side clasp. The locket opened to reveal 2 high-definition miniature photographs. On the left side was a clear, smiling picture of baby Maya. On the right side was a carefully restored, enhanced photograph of Clara's late daughter, Ava. Engraved on the back of the gold heart were 7 simple words. "To the woman who kept our hearts beating." Clara stared at the locket, her breath catching in her throat. A fresh wave of soft, quiet tears filled her hazel eyes. But they were not tears of grief. They were tears of deep, healing restoration. "I can't accept this, Julian," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "This is too precious." "You must accept it, Clara," Julian said softly, kneeling beside her chair. "It's not a gift or a payment for your work. It's a reminder that Ava's love didn't end when she left this world. She led you here to save Maya, and she will always be a part of this family." Julian took the gold chain and carefully clasped it around Clara's neck. The gold heart rested gently against her chest, right over her heart. At that exact moment, baby Maya pushed herself up from Clara's lap. She placed her tiny, chubby hands against Clara's knees, balanced her trembling legs, and stood upright on her own 2 feet. Julian held his breath. Clara froze, her eyes widening in wonder. Maya took one wobbly, uncertain step forward across the plush rug, then a second step, and then threw her tiny arms around Clara's neck, letting out a bright, joyous laugh as she spoke 2 clear, perfect words. Manache. Clara let out a broken, tearful laugh, pulling the child close to her heart, kissing her cheeks over and over again, holding her with the fiercest, purest love a human soul could offer. Julian sat on the floor beside them, putting his arm around Clara's shoulders, pulling his daughter and the woman who had saved her into a tight, permanent embrace. Years passed. The seasons changed outside the iron gates of the Lakeshore estate. Spring brought blooming roses to the garden paths. Winter brought snow capping the pine trees along Lake Michigan. Maya grew tall, brave, and joyful, scraping her knees in the courtyard, painting handprints on the playroom walls, and learning her lessons sitting beside Clara on that very same garden stone bench where they had once spent a freezing night together. Clara never left. She didn't clean the floors or fold the clothes. Julian hired a full domestic staff to take care of the estate, but Clara remained the absolute heart of the home. They called her Mama C, and no one in Chicago ever questioned her place at the Hayes table again. When Maya turned 7 years old, her teacher asked her class to write a short essay titled, "Who is the most important person in your life?" Maya didn't hesitate. She wrote in her neat, childish print, "My dad raised me, and my Mama C saved me. She held me in the dark when I was cold, and she taught me that love is the strongest thing in the world." One warm summer evening, as the sun dipped low beneath the Chicago horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep gold and purple, Julian stood on the second-floor balcony looking down at the garden. There, sitting on the old stone bench beneath the weeping willow, was Clara and 7-year-old Maya. Maya was reading a storybook out loud, while Clara sat beside her, her hands resting peacefully in her lap, the gold heart locket catching the dying sunlight against her chest. Julian leaned against the balcony railing, a soft, profound peace filling his chest. He looked up at the quiet evening sky and whispered into the warm breeze. "I used to think love was something you had to build with power and money, but the woman who had the least showed us that love is something you give away until it heals everything." And as the evening crickets began to sing across the lawn, the Lakeshore estate, once a cold, silent fortress of marble and grief, stood bathed in the warm, eternal light of a home that had finally found its heart.